My brother got the empire. My sister got the mansions and the restaurants. And me? I got a box so small it could have fit inside one of her designer handbags. In that oak-paneled room in Charleston, laughter echoed louder than the storm outside. William's smirk was polished. Susan's pity was painted on like her makeup, and the lawyer's silence was almost cruel. They thought my father's legacy had skipped me entirely. They thought the box was nothing. But I could already feel it pulsing in my hands like a live wire, waiting to deliver a truth powerful enough to shatter the Collins name forever. Before I go further, I'd love to know, have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Share your feelings in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Charleston, Chicago, California, or across the ocean. I want to hear your voice, and if stories like this strike a chord with you, hit subscribe, so you never miss the moments where injustice turns into revelation. My name is Henry Collins. I'm 65 years old, a retired high school history teacher who once chose the classroom over the boardroom. I could have joined my father's shipping company. He begged me to. But I believed young minds mattered more than moving cargo across oceans. That choice made me the black sheep, the disappointment, the one whose name was whispered rather than spoken. And now, in the most defining moment of our family's history, all I had was a weathered wooden box placed on the table like an insult. The will reading felt like theater. William sat straight-backed, already sliding into Father's chair as if it had always been waiting for him. His inheritance, the Collins Shipping Company, valued at $60 million. Susan dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief as the lawyer announced her reward: every restaurant, every rental property, every share Father had tucked away. The applause of their success was deafening. Then came my turn. The lawyer cleared his throat, hesitated, and laid the box before me. Small, plain, locked. Susan's laugh was brittle. Daddy always said you loved teaching about the past. Maybe that box is your history lesson. William chuckled, already reaching for a glass of brandy. Even the lawyer couldn't meet my gaze. In that moment, I wanted to shrink into the floorboards, back into the boy who was told he'd never be enough. But the box was heavier than it looked. The grain of the wood was scarred, the brass lock tarnished with age. As I traced it with my fingertips, I felt my father's shadow pressing down, stern and unyielding. All my life, he had criticized me, dismissed me, pushed me away from the empire he built. Yet here in this box, he had left me something, and I knew deep down it wasn't charity. It was a test, or maybe a key. Their laughter followed me out into the rain, but the sound no longer cut as deep, because as thunder rolled over the harbor and the live oaks bent with the wind, I held that box against my chest. And in that storm, I realized my father had given me not the least, but the only thing that mattered. Something that could tear open every lie my family was built upon. I drove away from that house of polished wood and cold laughter, with the box still pressed against me, the rain soaking through my coat. The windshield wipers beat in rhythm with my heartbeat, and each sweep across the glass felt like it was trying to clear away the blur of humiliation. Yet the storm outside only mirrored the one within. That house had never felt like home to me, not when I was a boy, not when I was a man, and certainly not now as the rejected son with nothing more than a locked box to show for 65 years of loyalty that no one ever acknowledged. My father, Edward Collins, believed success was measured in contracts signed and ships loaded, never in classrooms or students' eyes lit with understanding. The first time I told him I wanted to teach, he looked at me as if I'd confessed a crime. A Collins doesn't waste his life on chalk and textbooks, he said. Your brothers and sisters will build empires. You'll be left behind. That prophecy became a weapon he wielded until the day he died, each family gathering a reminder of how little I measured up. But there was one voice that always drowned out his judgment, my mother's. Margaret Collins. She had the kind of grace that made even a stern man like my father soften for a heartbeat, though never for long. She would sneak me out to the old library downtown, slip history books into my backpack, whisper, "The world needs more truth-tellers than it does businessmen." When she passed away, I was 15, still more boy than man. The house turned colder than marble. The air never smelled of her cinnamon bread again. The laughter never rose from her piano, and the shield that had protected me from my father's wrath was gone forever. I grew into a man my father despised, modest content, with a teacher's salary more at home among dusty maps than in the boardroom. And yet every lesson I gave every student I guided toward college felt like a rebellion against the dynasty he demanded I serve. That night, after the will reading, as I sat in my truck staring at the rain-streaked glass, a frail hand touched my shoulder. Aunt Carol. My father's younger sister, nearly forgotten by the family, left to live in a nursing home on the edge of town. She had attended the reading quietly, nearly invisible in the corner, her gray hair pulled back in a bun that trembled with each cough. She leaned in close, her voice rasping, but steady. "Don't underestimate that box, Henry. Your father planned this for years. He left the empire to William and the glitter to Susan, but that box, that's the one thing he guarded until the end." Her words struck deeper than any laughter that had filled the room. Carol had never spoken much. My father kept her at a distance, dismissing her as eccentric. But I remembered the way she used to slip me candy when father wasn't looking, the way her eyes softened when he scolded me too harshly. She knew something, perhaps, something no one else in that room cared to remember. I turned toward her, but before I could ask, her nurse was already guiding her out into the storm. Her warning lingered like a riddle. He prepared it. What could a locked box contain that mattered more than millions? As I drove back to my small house, the memories pressed in like ghosts, my mother's gentle voice urging me toward the truth, my father's steel eyes narrowing whenever I spoke of teaching the photographs on the hallway wall, where I always stood a step behind my siblings. That box was more than an inheritance. It was a thread pulling me back through every scar, every silence, every unspoken secret of our family. And as thunder cracked above Charleston Harbor, I gripped the steering wheel tighter and whispered to the empty seat beside me, "All my life you told me I was nothing, Father. Now you've left me with something that might prove you wrong." When I finally stepped back into my modest home that night, the storm had followed me. Rain drummed against the tin awning. The old floorboards creaked with each step, and the smell of damp paper filled the air from stacks of history journals scattered across my living room. I placed the box on my kitchen table, its dark wood scarred with scratches like it had fought its way through time just to land here. For hours I stared at it, sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to summon the courage. Aunt Carol's warning echoed in my head, "Don't underestimate that box, Henry." He prepared it. At last, with trembling hands, I took a screwdriver and pried open the lock. The brass gave way with a sound that seemed louder than thunder. Inside, there was no gold watch, no deed, no comforting trinket to make me feel less of an outsider. Instead, 3 items lay neatly arranged, as though Father himself had just placed them there. A tarnished key, a yellowed map folded so many times its creases threatened to tear, and a slip of paper edges browned bearing 4 words written in his tight script: "Seek the truth. Savannah, First Trust, 1975. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My father had mocked my teaching career as nothing but chasing dead years, yet here he was leaving me a puzzle rooted in history. Savannah First Trust. 1975. Why that year? Why that place? I unfolded the map carefully, and the faded ink revealed the outline of downtown Savannah. Streets I remembered from childhood visits with Mother when she would sneak us away for summer picnics by the river. A red circle marked a corner block where the bank had once stood. The paper smelled of mildew and secrets. And then tucked beneath the map, I found something that froze my blood, an old photograph. My father, though younger, maybe in his 30s, stood stiff in a suit, his arm resting on the shoulder of a man I had never seen before. The stranger's eyes were sharp, his smile forced, and there was something in the way Father leaned slightly toward him that unsettled me. My father, who never let anyone close, who treated even his children like business assets, stood there looking almost deferential. On the back of the photograph, written in the same hand that had scrawled, "Seek the truth," was a single word, debt. I sat there in silence, the key cold in my palm. Debt. My father had built an empire, lectured us endlessly about integrity and strength, but here was evidence that he had owed something or someone far greater than money. Who was this man? And why had Father hidden his existence from us? The house groaned in the storm, the power flickered, and I realized my hands were shaking. This was no sentimental keepsake. This was a directive. He had left William the empire, Susan, the wealth, but me, he had left me the past, the one thing I'd spent my life defending. Only now it wasn't the past of textbooks or dates. It was his past. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the rain tapped harder. What truth could be buried in Savannah since 1975 that my father had guarded until his dying breath? Why leave me, the so-called failure, with the key to unlock it? The envelope might have been an insult to everyone else in that room, but now I knew this box was no insult at all. It was an invitation, a summons. My father had trusted me, the disappointment with a secret that could either redeem his name or destroy it beyond repair. The key was still heavy in my pocket when dawn broke, gray and reluctant, as if even the sun didn't want to rise on the weight of what I had uncovered. Sleep had been impossible. The words on that slip of paper, "Seek the truth." Savannah. First Trust, 1975, burned behind my eyes like scripture. By the time the coffee pot hissed, I had already made up my mind. I would drive to Savannah. My truck was as worn as I was, an old Ford, with a cracked windshield and a rattle that sang along with the highway. As I pulled onto I-95, the rain finally eased, leaving the road slick and gleaming. Mile after mile, memories pressed in summers by the Savannah River, with Mother, her laughter carrying on the wind, the way she told me that cities remember secrets better than people do. I never thought I'd return to that city chasing my father's ghost. Savannah greeted me with its moss-draped oaks and cobblestone streets, timeless and secretive. The First Trust building still stood on the corner, marked in red on Father's map, though the name had long since been chiseled off its marble facade. It was no longer a bank, just an empty shell repurposed into a law office. My heart sank until a name surfaced in my memory, Mr. Daniels. He had been the bank's manager when I was a child. If anyone knew what my father had hidden, it would be him. I found him in a retirement home near Forsyth Park, a place that smelled of liniment and fading wallpaper. Mr. Daniels was in his late 80s now, his frame brittle, but his eyes sharp as ever. When I introduced myself, his gaze narrowed as if measuring me against a memory. "Edward's boy," he said at last, voice like dry leaves rustling. "I wondered when you'd come." The words sent a chill up my spine. "You knew I would." He nodded slowly. "Your father made arrangements back in '75. Told me one day his youngest would come looking. Said you were the only one he could trust." I swallowed hard. "Trust me with what Daniels gestured for me to sit." His hands, though gnarled, were steady as he opened a drawer and pulled out a leather folder so old its edges had curled. Inside were yellowing documents stamped with government seals, faded photographs and notes scribbled in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "What you're about to see," Daniels said, "was never meant to exist." I leaned forward, pulse pounding. The photographs showed my father, young, intense, sitting in conference rooms with men in military uniforms and dark suits. One document dated 1975 referenced a strategic port agreement tied to the Cold War. Another detailed payments funneled through shell companies, money exchanged not for trade, but for silence. My mouth went dry. My father was involved in politics. Daniels shook his head. Not politics. Survival. Edward Collins was more than a businessman. He became a broker in a game bigger than shipping Cold War leverage. Savannah's ports were prime real estate for moving more than just cargo. Your father cut a deal that gave him wealth, yes, but it bound him to people whose power didn't stop at borders. I stared at the folder, my stomach twisting. The photograph of father with the unknown man suddenly made sense. He wasn't just a stranger. He was one of those shadow figures Daniels described, men who traded influence like weapons. And my father, the man who dismissed me for wasting life on chalk and maps, had been living a double life built on secrets. "Why tell me this now?" I whispered. Daniel's gaze softened, almost pitying. "Because Edward wanted you to know the truth. He said the others, William, Susan, were already compromised. But you carried your mother's integrity. He told me you'd either bury this or burn the lies down." The folder trembled in my hands. My father hadn't left me out of his legacy, he'd handed me its darkest chapter. And in that moment, sitting in the quiet of that retirement home, I realized the box hadn't been a burden. It was a summons to confront a truth 40 years in the making. Daniel slid the leather folder closer, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "There's more," he said, almost in a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Your father didn't just keep records. He left behind something substantial." With trembling fingers, he unlocked a small steel box he had hidden in the drawer. The hinges squealed as though protesting 40 years of silence. Inside were reels of magnetic tape, brittle with age, each marked with dates and initials. Alongside them sat typed contracts stamped with notaries from ports as far-flung as Hamburg, Havana, and Hong Kong. And then the document that made my breath catch, an agreement detailing payments funneled through consulting fees that were nothing more than bribes. Bribes to secure shipping lanes. Bribes to silence inspectors. Bribes that built the very empire my father had handed to William. As Daniels turned the yellowed pages, I saw my brother's name. William Collins, Junior Counsel, 1981. He had signed off on a transaction when he was barely out of law school. My stomach clenched. My father hadn't acted alone. William had helped bury the evidence under mountains of legalese and false fronts. And for all those years he had played the dutiful son while sneering at me for teaching high school history. I pressed my hand to the table to steady myself. He let William in, but not me. Daniel's gaze was heavy. "Edward said you were the only one who could stay clean. William was already too much like him. Susan, too, entangled in her ambitions. But he kept you away, so when the time came, you could be the one to choose. The one to choose." The words felt like shackles and wings all at once. Daniels reached for another folder, this one newer, thicker. Inside lay a Swiss bank statement bearing the date of my father's death. The balance made me blink twice. $70,000. Not part of the empire, not tainted money, but a fund he had built quietly from legitimate contracts, tucked away outside the family's grasp. This, Daniels said, tapping the page with a frail finger, is the true inheritance, not for yachts, not for estates. He earmarked it for truth. To finance an exposure of everything Mercer and Collins built on lies. I felt the room tilt. My father, the man who ridiculed my life's work, who dismissed me as weak, had left me a war chest to dismantle his own empire. My thoughts spiraled back to my mother, Margaret. I remembered her soft hand on my cheek when I was 15, the night before she went into the hospital for the last time. She had whispered words I didn't understand then. One day, Henry, you'll be the one to set it right. For years I thought she meant my own life, the shame of being the underachiever. But now I knew. She had known about the bribes, about the corruption. She had carried the weight of silence to keep me safe, the youngest, the only one not drawn into father's schemes. I pressed the photograph of father and that unknown man against the table. Debt. The word haunted me. Was the $70 million payment of a debt, or the means to settle one? Daniels leaned closer. Edward wanted you to know he wasn't as cold as he seemed. Every harsh word, every dismissal, it was armor. He was keeping you out of the mud because he needed one child left untainted. I looked down at the tapes, the contracts, the damning evidence. My brother and sister lived in luxury built on deceit, while I had spent my life in a modest classroom. And yet now the balance of power had shifted. They had the empire, yes, but I held its undoing. I gathered the papers with shaking hands. The box was no longer just a mystery. It was a torch passed down through fire, a burden disguised as inheritance. My father hadn't chosen William the lawyer. He hadn't chosen Susan the socialite. He had chosen me, the failure, the exile, the teacher, to carry the truth. And in that moment I understood the $70 million wasn't wealth. It was a responsibility, a sword waiting to strike. I left Daniel's room with the folder pressed tight against my chest, as though someone might rip it away before I could reach the door. The late afternoon light spilled through the moss-hung oaks of Savannah, warm and golden, yet it carried no comfort. My father's secret fund, the tapes, the contracts, $70 million tethered not to wealth, but to a mission. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a ticking clock counting down to a decision I didn't know if I had the strength to make. Back in Charleston, the house felt emptier than ever. I spread the evidence across my kitchen table, each page a blade pointed at the Collins name. For hours I stared. If I went public, I would destroy the company my father built, the empire William now ruled. I would drag Susan's polished reputation through the mud. Every Collins portrait hanging in that grand old mansion would become a lie in a frame. But if I stayed silent, I would become no better than the men my father had once bargained with, complicit through cowardice. That night I sought refuge in the only place left untouched by deceit, the small church on the corner of Meeting Street. Its wooden pews smelled of candle wax and dust the same as they had when I was a boy. Pastor John. My mother's oldest friend stood near the altar, his hands folded over his Bible. His hair was white now, his back bent, but his voice still carried that gentle conviction that had steadied so many before me. He listened without interruption, as I spilled the truth, every sordid detail, from the bribes to the Swiss account. When I finished, my words hung heavy in the silence. He placed a weathered hand on mine and said softly, "Henry, your father gave you the burden because he knew you carried your mother's heart." Margaret believed truth was never a weapon, but a gift. Sometimes the hardest gift to give is the one that hurts first before it heals. His words cut deeper than any sermon. Truth as a gift. Could exposing it be an act of love, not vengeance? I thought I had time to wrestle with that choice. But William arrived at my doorstep 2 nights later. He didn't knock. He never did. He simply walked in, his suit crisp, his cologne heavy, carrying the arrogance of a man who believed the world bent to him. His smile was sharp as ever, but his eyes flicked nervously to the papers spread across my table. "So it's true," he said, voice low. "Father gave it to you." I said nothing, only folded the nearest document. His smile tightened. "You don't understand what you're holding, Henry. These records, if they see daylight, they'll burn everything. Not just the company, our name, our legacy. Our legacy," I snapped. "Or yours." He ignored the sting. "Listen, little brother, I can make this easy for you. Join me. I'll give you a seat on the board, a share of the profits, the respect you always wanted. Or," he tapped the folder with one manicured finger, "you keep this to yourself, and I'll make sure you never want for anything. House car trips to Europe. You've spent your life in chalk-dusted classrooms. Don't tell me you don't want more." I looked at him, the brother who had laughed at my box, who had called me a failure since we were boys. Now here he was, bargaining with me like one of father's rivals, dangling money and power like bait. And for the first time, I saw fear flicker behind his polished mask. The offer lingered in the air, heavy with temptation. All I had to do was close the folder and walk away. I could live the rest of my days in comfort, let the past rot in silence. Or I could choose the path my mother had whispered about, the path my father had prepared me for, without my knowing. As William waited, impatient and certain I would bend, Pastor John's words rang in my mind. Truth is the hardest gift to give. I glanced at the folder. My hands shook not from weakness, but from the weight of knowing once I chose, there would be no turning back. William's offer hung in the air long after he left my kitchen, his promises of comfort and power clinging to the walls like smoke. But I knew the moment his polished shoes clicked down my porch steps that I could never accept. I had lived my life in quiet classrooms, teaching young minds about courage and consequence. If I stayed silent now, every lesson I had ever spoken would collapse into hypocrisy. The next morning, I packed the evidence into a weathered briefcase and drove to the Charleston Gazette, the only newspaper in town still run by men who valued ink over influence. The editor, a wiry man with glasses perched low on his nose, listened in silence as I laid out the documents, the tapes, the bank statements. His expression hardened with every page. By the time I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Collins, this isn't just a story. This is dynamite." The fuse lit quickly. The Gazette contacted the FBI. Agents came in plain suits, their questions sharp and relentless. I handed over everything, every tape, every contract, every piece of my father's shadow empire. Their faces betrayed nothing but when one of them said, "You did the right thing." I felt the weight on my chest lift just enough for me to breathe. Weeks later, the storm broke in Atlanta. A federal courthouse, its marble columns gleaming under the harsh light of television cameras, became the stage where the Collins family legacy unraveled. Reporters shouted questions as William strode inside, his jaw tight, his arrogance cracked, but not yet broken. Susan arrived separately, her pearls gleaming against her black dress, her eyes darting as though searching for an exit no one else could see. Inside the courtroom, the evidence played out like a funeral dirge. The tapes of bribes, William's signature on falsified contracts, Susan's name tied to accounts that funneled money through her restaurant chain. My father's empire. The fortress he had built, stone by stone, crumbled under the weight of truth. I sat on the witness stand, my hands folded, my voice steady. The prosecutor asked why I had come forward. I thought of my mother and answered simply, because silence is another form of corruption. When the verdicts came, the air seemed to crack. William was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Susan faced charges of money laundering. The Collins mansion, the proud oak-paneled house where I had once stood humiliated, was sealed by federal order. Yellow tape stretched across its heavy doors, the family portraits inside reduced to evidence tags. On the courthouse steps, the cameras turned to me. Reporters thrust microphones forward, their voices overlapping in a frenzy. "Mr. Collins, how does it feel to destroy your own family?" one shouted. I paused, the weight of generations pressing down on me, then said, "I didn't destroy my family. I destroyed the lies that were destroying us all." The words carried across the crowd, across television screens, into living rooms, across the country. For the first time, my voice mattered not in a classroom, not in a family argument, but in the full glare of truth. That night, I returned to my small home. The television replayed the footage on every channel. William in handcuffs, Susan shielding her face from the cameras, the Collins estate locked down. The empire was gone, the name tarnished beyond repair. Yet for the first time in my life, I felt something close to peace. My father had left me a burden disguised as a box. I had carried it into the light, and in doing so, I had torn open wounds that would never fully heal. But the truth had spoken, and its echo was louder than all the laughter that had once mocked me. The night after the courthouse verdicts, I sat in my living room, the glow of the television fading, as news anchors dissected the fall of the Collins empire. William in chains. Susan fleeing the cameras. The house of my childhood wrapped in federal tape. It was all there on the screen, a family tragedy broadcast to the nation. But when I turned off the set, silence filled the room, and for the first time in decades, it wasn't the silence of shame. It was peace. The Swiss account, once a mystery wrapped in secrecy, now lay open to me. $70 million more than I had ever dared imagine sat waiting not for indulgence, but for purpose. I remembered my mother's voice, soft but resolute. The world needs more truth-tellers than it does businessmen. Those words had carried me through classrooms and quiet nights, and now they guided me to the only decision that made sense. Within a year, the Margaret Collins Community Center opened its doors on the edge of Charleston. A modest brick building, nothing ornate but alive with the sound of children's laughter and the scrape of pencils across paper. Here kids who had been forgotten by the system found tutors' hot meals and a place to dream bigger than the limits of poverty. I walked the halls each morning, greeting them as if they were my own students again. The center bore my mother's name, not mine, because the legacy worth preserving was hers, the legacy of kindness, faith, and unwavering belief in the power of learning. Susan never came back from Europe. Rumors drifted of her living in rented villas along the coast of Spain, trying to rebuild a life among strangers who didn't know her shame. William's fate was less merciful. He traded Armani suits for prison blues, his arrogance replaced by silence. I visited once, standing across the glass divider, as he stared at me with eyes full of betrayal. "You destroyed us," he said. But I shook my head. "No, William. I freed us. You just can't see it yet." Aunt Carol, frail but sharp as ever, moved into my home. For years she had been discarded, tucked away, as if she were an embarrassment to the family. Now she sat on my porch each evening, knitting as the sun sank into Charleston Harbor. "Your mother would be proud," she told me one night. I believed her. For the first time, I allowed myself to, and sometimes when the house was quiet and the center had closed for the day, I drove to the shoreline and stood where the Atlantic kissed the Carolina coast. The waves rolled in steady, eternal, carrying whispers only the sea could hold. I heard my father's voice, in memory cold, yet strangely tender. "You don't need money to find your worth, Henry. You need the truth." For so long I thought my inheritance had been humiliation, that I was destined to be the family's disappointment. But in the end, the truth was my inheritance. Not the wealth, not the empire, not the ruined mansion. The truth, ugly, liberating, undeniable, was the one thing my father entrusted to me alone. As I watched the tide swallow the horizon, I realized legacy isn't carved into marble floors or sealed in bank accounts. Legacy is what survives when lies are stripped away. For me, it was the laughter of children in a community center that bore my mother's name. It was Aunt Carol's peace in her final years. It was the freedom of knowing I had chosen honesty over comfort, justice over silence. And so my story closes not with riches or revenge, but with truth. For anyone my age who wonders what remains when wealth and reputation crumble, I can tell you this: the truth endures. It always does.